Welcome back to The Responsible Edge, the podcast where we explore the bold ideas, uncomfortable truths, and unexpected solutions shaping the future of responsible business. Today on the show, we're learning how the textile industry is being rewired, moving away from fossil-based synthetics towards renewable, bio-based fibres. And our article this week that we're going to use to uncover this is Get Ready for the EU's Eco-Design and Digital Product Passport, a roadmap to the most ambitious regulatory shake-up in fashion's modern history. And our guest to unpack all of this this Friday morning, I'm delighted to say, is Simon Whitmarsh-Knight, a global textile and apparel expert whose work spans supply chain transformation, circularity, and innovation adoption. Simon, it's absolutely fantastic to have you on the show this morning. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Charlie. Really enjoyed getting to know you and this process, since we've been chatting for a few months. So look forward to the conversation and thank you for the very kind introduction. I've been called many things in my time, but a global textiles expert is not one of them recently. So thank you very much for that.
And the self-deprecating nature of you, Simon, is one of the things that has attracted me to this conversation more than anything, knowing what you've done in your career so far. And speaking of which, I've just given a very brief overview as to some of your areas of expertise. But for those listeners and viewers who aren't aware of you and the work that you're doing at the moment, can you give us a bit more meat on the bone?
Sure. Just in terms of my role and the company that I'm working for. So I'm now the Global Sustainability Director for Hyosung. Hyosung is an international business, and the bit of the business that I work for is our textiles division. And in that textiles division, we are really a complete sustainable solutions provider. And what does that mean? It means we make a lot of fiber. And we work with our value chain partners to help them adopt those fibers in terms of giving the quality, performance they need for finished fabrics and garments, and also answering more and more the questions and the challenges around what added sustainability benefits to those fibers bring. So Hyosung, as I say, is part of a large international business. We're headquartered in Seoul, so we're proudly South Korean, but we manufacture our fibers around the world, which is really important for customers as the ongoing shifts in global sourcing and supply chain strategies continue to evolve, most recently on a daily or hourly basis, given some of the challenges that everybody faces in this space.
Simon, that was a brilliant nutshell introduction. You've certainly done this before. For our listeners and viewers that want to sort of dig a little deeper into the work that you do at Hyosung, they can obviously we'll link through to various websites and to your LinkedIn profile, etc.
Sure.
Just to give us for my sort of simplicity of understanding where you guys fit and when you refer to customers, who are your customers as a company?
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, Charlie. Thanks. I hadn't sort of thought of it that way. So we're in this global textiles value chain, and depending on whether you talk about a tier 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., generally tier 1 suppliers are garment makers to the brands and retailers. And we're a little bit further up the chain, if you like, at the start of the chain. So we are probably considered by most companies a tier 3 supplier, which means we're a fiber supplier. So directly answering your question, our direct customers are the mills. That's where we make the commercial transaction. We make fiber, not quite at the very beginning of the value chain, but sort of one step along, if you like. We make our own fiber, then we sell that fiber to mills around the world. Then the mills, in their turn, will sell their fabric to a garment maker and then onto a brand and retailer. Now, that's probably oversimplifying the textiles value chain because there are many other parts within that. But effectively, that's kind of a 101 on the value chain. So fiber producer to fabric mill to garment maker to then brand and retailer. So back to your question, Charlie, our direct customers are the mills who are using our fiber to make fabric. Mm-hmm. Our indirect customer are the brands and retailers. So that's where we as a marketing team spend a lot of our time, because we call them indirect customers because they're not probably buying directly from us, but we need to go and see them at the end of the value chain to talk to them about what their challenges are, what are they looking for their garments, what kind of performance, quality, durability. And as we said in the intro, more and more those conversations start around sustainability challenges. You know, how can our fibers help them reduce their carbon emissions or, use less water in the whole processing. So again, even though they're not buying from us, really important that we spend a lot of time with global brands and retailers, finding out what they're looking for, talking through our innovations. And then our role is to work up and down the value chain with their partners to help them get the projects up and running, to help them adopt new fibers.
And Simon, again, excuse my naivety as I ask you very simple questions here, but is it so your direct customer, the mill or the mills, if you like, in this instance, that's not where the pressure's coming from a sustainability, or not, pressure might not be the right term, I might be overstating that, but the concern, if you like, about your approach to sustainability is coming from further up the value chain, from your indirect customer, less so from direct.
That's another cracking question, Chai, actually. I think everybody in the value chain or value system, which is a better way of describing it, is feeling or understands the pressure and the need to change, which is a good thing. So ultimately, we would hope, where is the pressure coming from? In an ideal world, it would come from the consumer saying, I would like a more sustainable garment, however you define that, and I am willing to pay more money for it. That's obviously happens in some cases, but not in the majority of cases. So this is where I think, and we'll probably dive into this a bit later on, regulations are also going to help us, I think, in that way, changing behavior. But directly to your point around where's the pressure, where are the needs around sustainability coming from? Yes, of course, we're all trying to make products that we can sell and be competitive and keep going as a business, and then invest in more sustainable things. So ultimately, we want brand and retailers to be pulling through those innovations. So asking for innovations because they see their customers are going to be asking for them, their end users, or they see regulations moving in that way. So that's the kind of pull through influence that we would hope to see in the value system. We're kind of pushing the fiber to the mills. The brands and retailers are pulling through that innovation. But the whole thing is changing, Charlie, and mills and garment makers are also being asked to deliver more innovation to brand and retailers. They don't just make them. In many cases, they're not just being given an order. They make the order. Thank you very much. They're being asked to bring innovation and newness to their customers. So to answer your question, it's pretty much each link in the chain is looking for innovation. So a mill wants to have something new to sell to their garment maker or to take to a brand. The garment maker wants a new story so that when they show their garment to their brand and retailer, it's got a story to go with it. So whilst we hope that the end consumer is doing all that pull through, actually all part of the value system is thinking about newness and how they can use that new story to almost, if you like, sell to the next part in the chain.
Fascinating.
Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense, and it's I know you're brilliantly simplifying things for my level of understanding, which is landing really, really clearly. So I really can see how those relationships are at play, and how, as you described, you almost ideally have every sort of agent within that value chain involved in innovation, in development, taking responsibility themselves for making what they do as part of that chain more sustainable and new, as you described, with greater innovation, that stories that then can be sold, if you like, along that value chain. So I can understand that. That's a really, really clear kind of picture. Simon, before I get like more of a sort of a 101 in learning all things about the textile industry from you, which I feel like we could definitely just do a podcast on that. My listeners and viewers are going to be intrigued as to how you ended up in this role, working for a company, as you say, based in South Korea and all the sort of the global sort of instances of the work that you do. Let's go back to the beginning, though, the beginning of the story. Like, how do we end up here? What were the things as a young man that sort of inspired you to ultimately end up doing what you've done with your career?
Well, thanks, Joe. Yeah, you're asking me to go back a long way now, certainly compared to a lot of your listeners and viewers, I would think. But and I'm not particularly great at talking about myself. What I really love is coaching and mentoring, and I'm learning a lot through mentoring at the moment, because my mentees ask me exactly the same as you, Charlie. How did you get where you are now? And then which is understandable, because that's the role of a mentor, to help them see that and help them get there. Mm-hmm. But my background, I guess, has always been around probably communication and people. I studied languages at uni many years ago, and then found myself in the sports and sort of fashion industry. So started out in sort of an ingredient brand business making waterproof breathable membranes back home in Norfolk. So that gave me a great start into the world of sales and marketing. And I think that's probably where my sort of background and development has been, Charlie. So I've sort of focused on growing business, building teams, working in international companies, both in sort of finished goods, in sort of fitness equipment or sports equipment. And in the last sort of 10, 15 years, more in the ingredient brand space. So helping companies sort of put together a more complete story for their end users in the textiles, so performance textiles and apparel space. So along the way, after languages, I tried to keep studying, and, I've got a love of learning. That's really important to me, to keep trying to do new things, keep learning. So in terms of help and advice for maybe younger people listening out, for me, languages was a great start. But being English, of course, all our customers wanted to speak English, and their English was much better than my languages. So completely didn't use those languages at all. But obviously for me, a love of language and an interest in cultures is really important. Again, something we may come back to later on. Go for it, Charlie.
Sorry, I'm going to ask you on that, because it's a fascinating, again, it's something, it's a commonality actually of guests that we have on the show, that there's almost sort of truncating, if you like, of different stages of careers, whereby education is brought back in. Somebody does a master's, or they do an additional piece of sort of training of some description, and there's, as you say, there's that thirst for knowledge and for learning that seems to be a common thing throughout the senior people that I have an opportunity to speak to. What did that look like for you in terms of your different stages of your career? You obviously did your undergrad in languages. Which languages did you study out of interest?
I did French and Spanish.
Very good, very good. Well, you'll be brilliantly great to hear that I am not going to test you on either of those fronts. So you've gone to double it. But in terms of other stages throughout your career where you did various forms of sort of educational pieces, like when did you do what?
Yeah. And actually, that's a helpful way of thinking of it in terms of, my limited experience and where I find I can help to give some advice, and the benefit of being an older guy who's been in the industry for ages and ages is what I tend to say to sort of my mentees now is exactly that: stay curious, just keep trying stuff, keep learning. And, AI for us, is a great example of that, all of us having to sort of think about how we can use that. So that's one hopefully helpful piece of advice to, the young people that I help along the way, is keep learning, stay curious, try new things. So for me, that really started with more formal qualifications in marketing. So when I started working straight out of uni, sales and marketing assistant, it was a great opportunity to get to know the nuts and bolts of a business. This, of course, is pre-internet, Charlie. So, doing some research projects would mean going down to the government department to help support exporting, all that sort of stuff. They had a special library there where you could go and consult market reports. So this was really sort of starting at the ground level stuff in terms of getting some marketing knowledge. And really that then made me realize I needed a bit of structure to that. So I started doing some Chartered Institute of Marketing exams. So during the evening, advanced certificate, diploma, and then eventually I finished a master's in marketing. So really tough to be working and studying at the same time. And by then we'd had kids as well, but also good because it allowed you to look at theory as well as practice. So that was really the first iteration for me in terms of early career, putting some more formalized qualifications around some of the things I was seeing and doing and learning about. And I found that very helpful as a balance of, as I say, theory and practice. The latter stages of my career, Charlie, sorry, just to finish on the sort of arc of keeping curious and learning, has been really, as I've just grown and, in terms of career progression, that comes often with building and developing teams, and often international teams. And how does that work? What's interesting? What's helpful? What are the mistakes you make along the way? So that, again, sort of spurred the interest for me in people, communication. How does that, work across cultures? And specifically for me, that's really focused in on coaching and mentoring. And so as part of my role, and then as doing some volunteering for a couple of institutions here in the UK. So recently I've completed some further studies in some coaching and mentoring, Charlie, which again, that's a personal thing. Marketing is great. It helps with the structure and the thinking around how to do certain things. But the coaching and mentoring is probably a reflection of how I like to be as a person, as a leader, etc. And that's been a really interesting part of my experience.
And I want to ask you one question on this, and then I want to ask you one more question on you before we go on with this week's article.
Yeah, thanks.
But on that point about your learning around leadership, like what has been, since you sort of, focused your curiosity towards learning how to lead or developing your own leadership, like what's the number one lesson that you've learned in all your experience that's led you to become a better leader?
Wow. I wasn't expecting for us to go in this direction, Charlie, this morning, but that's a super question. And listen, I'm not a leadership expert, would never claim to be, would never want to be. But some of the things, and hopefully my kids would say the same if they remember anything that their old man's told them, it's all about people. And if you think about that, think about the effect we have on people, how you make them feel, how we communicate, what are the things going on in their lives, as well as what do we need to do in terms of, the business. For me, that's probably the thing that I come back to and I've learned along the way and would try and instill with maybe some of the mentees that I work with is we're dealing people to people here still. And so think about that person and what's going on for them, how they learn. We've got, there's a lot of focus on sort of neurodiversity these days, which I think is great. So an appreciation, a curiosity about how they function is helpful in many ways. How clear are you as a leader? Are you giving them support? So long answer to your question, Charlie, sorry, but for me, it starts and finishes with people.
But Simon, I think it's a brilliant response because you've picked out something that I think is understated at times when it comes to realizing the power that we have as leaders to affect the people that we're working with, and that seems like an obvious thing that can be sort of just po-poed, but really thinking about the human being that's in front of you and the fact that the way that you engage with them, that they're likely to take that experience with them, and it's likely to affect them in ways that you really, if you're not careful, you won't account for. Is that a fair observation, that you just need to, what you're describing is just being really, really aware of and sensitive to the impact that you can have?
Definitely. It's a great way of summarizing it, actually. And okay, we're in a business setting, so there are still needs of the business. But for me, it's how we do that and how we help one another, clarity of communication, and understanding of maybe some challenges along the way. And listen, I've made, lots of mistakes along the way. Of course, that's a great way to learn. So again, this isn't a podcast for me about being a leadership expert, but it has highlighted for me the key point, which is around people. And that's a person in front of you. There is a lot going on in the world right now. Yes, we're in a business setting. We can't bring that with us all the time, but an awareness of that is a helpful way to build a relationship. Then, if the other person chooses to be strange or, be difficult, that's their choice. But as long as, what our intentions are good at the start and, try and manage those difficulties along the way.
I love it. I mean, I think we're almost alluding to human-centered leadership, which I think is obviously fairly in vogue at the moment. Simon, let me ask you one more question before we go on to the article. But I in all honesty, I could do a whole show just back and forthing with you from this point, I feel like. But my one last question is on, obviously you're by trade, as you've alluded to, post languages, you're a marketing comms guy. You've then grown your career and developed it through a number of different sort of roles, and then you've ended up in a role which marriages together marketing, communications, and sustainability. Because this is just a fascinating area for me around when you have those dual roles that bridge marketing, comms, and sustainability. Just touch on, from your lived experience, if you like, your work experience, the why that works for you, that sort of marriage of those two functions.
Yeah, I think, and again, I'm not a qualified sustainability expert. There are lots of those, and that's great. And I would never claim to be one of those. what I hope I bring to the role is a customer appreciation, Charlie, because my route has been through sales and marketing, business development. So where I try and think about my point of difference sometimes is, I'm looking at through a commercial lens when it comes to sustainability. So of course we want to be doing the right thing as people and as an organization, but I hope the bit of difference that I can bring or leverage the experience I have, as I say, because I'm not, a qualified sustainability expert by any means, but the understanding of customers, the understanding of business pressures, both external then internal, I think is perhaps helpful to me in this role. So that sort of maybe that awareness of the commercial pressures, both externally and internally, because, an understanding of what's driving a customer's business, the pressures they're under, but also importantly, to your point on comms, how do we get that message back to the business? There's so much noise around always in business, not just in sustainability, but how do I, as a sustainability leader within our business, highlight the key things to my boss, and how do I help her sell those key issues to her boss? Because, that again, in terms of marriage of maybe the sales and marketing and communication, that's hopefully where I can also help in, as I say, an awareness of what's happening externally, the pressures, the focus for businesses, my direct dealings with customers, growing businesses, but then also how do we package that? How do we leverage that internally within the business? Also across cultures, Charlie, because I think one of the things I'm very fortunate to have done is worked in international businesses, UK businesses, international businesses, and there are many cultures within each company. There's not just one culture. So you also have to think carefully about how to say, leverage that message and how to help the next level sell that to their boss and their boss's boss, if you like.
Do you know what, Simon? I'm so pleased that you've responded to that question in this way and brought up these themes, because the thing I always come back to, the marriage of marketing comms with sustainability for me is a really pragmatic way of viewing sustainability. It's an understanding and appreciation, as you've alluded to, the commercial reality of embedding these new initiatives, these new ways of doing things need to be communicated in a way that's understandable and digestible to others within the organization. And therefore, it makes sense that you're aligning the need, if you like, to disseminate that information clearly, to convince action to be taken through the lens of somebody who knows how to communicate. So for me, I think that the sort of counter argument to that is sometimes that people view it as, well, if you're sort of partnering sustainability alongside marketing and comms, are you simply viewing it as a PR exercise essentially? But I think you're right. That's very what's the word? That's very clumsy almost to just sort of throw those two things together. Actually, it's important to look at, well, no, it can be done well, and if it's done well, it can be delivered in this way.
Yeah, you're right, and I think maybe that's a good summary. Also, perhaps the third thing I try and share with sort of mentees and young people that I help along the way. We talked around, staying curious and sort of love of learning, and also the fact that, things are, it's all about people. I think the third thing that I would often talk about, given my experience, is think about how you are giving your boss the tools to then sell that story or to understand what's important to them. What are their drivers? You may be responsible for a project, but it's got to land with the audience. So again, an awareness of what's important for the next person in your sort of chain is, we're getting more and more specific as we go along, but that's, I think, what you're alluding to there as well, Charlie. How does it land? What's important? We can't do everything, but what's going to be important to my boss to help move this along? And that's, again, something I've evolved and learned to share with my mentees as I've, grown in my mentoring experience.
It's fascinating, Simon. And also there's a clear sort of alignment, if you like, in what you were describing at the beginning in terms of the way that the industry as a whole needs to be affected in terms of inspiring change, if you like, through the communication across the value chain. It's the same rules apply just within an organization when we think about different departments and different individuals that we're looking to influence. It's a true story. It's a real story in having a deep appreciation, understanding of the intentions behind the individual that we're trying to affect, and understanding how the messages land. I love it. I'm as a marketeer myself, I'm trying to grab as much of this insight from you as possible, Simon. Let's move on now, though, if possible. Would you mind just providing sort of a brief introduction summary to the article that we're going to discuss, and then perhaps just pick out from it whatever you thought was most interesting in the piece?
Sure, and I'm looking at my notes here, Charlie, to make sure I get the title right for you as well. So, that, as you alluded to in the intro, this is an article entitled "Get Ready for the EU's Eco-Design and Digital Product Passport." I think it was a recent article on the Intertech website. So, thanks for sharing that. When I was looking at that earlier in the week, for some reason, the words Holy Trinity came to me, and I don't know why. And it's probably not the thing you should share on a podcast, but what I thought there was, the reason I thought that, I think, is because the article was talking about, for me, the three things that I see are so important in the industry. One, regulation. Two, digital tools. And three, the fibre innovation. So again, excuse me looking down here, I wanted to make sure I'm getting my notes right. But that's why I think the Holy Trinity came to me, because the article was effectively, yes, talking about some of the regulations coming, but also encompassing, those three critical areas, and they're so interlinked, they're so important, and that's kind of also, as I've been to some sustainability conferences, as we go to exhibitions and things. Okay, there's a bit of maybe confirmation bias coming here, but those are often the two or three themes that I see and sort of take back from the shows that we come to. As I say, they're all interlinked. I don't think we'll encourage consumer behavior on its own without regulations. And again, that's maybe a controversial point, but I think regulations will help us get there. Digital tools, I think, as a business, as an industry, are a huge opportunity for us. And we may talk in a while about how to turn some perceived threats into opportunities. But, the textiles industry probably is pretty old-fashioned. I know it's not the sexiest industry for, young people to get into. There are much more exciting things in theory, in the working world. But there are so many opportunities, I think, for us all in the textiles value system, especially when it comes to digitalization, which I'm sure we'll dive into a bit more deeply. And then, of course, directly for us, the third part of that is the fiber innovation. Yes, it ends with garments and products that are being sold, but it all starts with fiber. And so going back to our conversation around the value chain, that's why it's really important to have those connections across the value chain, because, fiber is what is making up the garments. And with the focus on recycling, textile to textile, circular business models, we've got to involve all those people in the value system. Otherwise, as we see currently with textile to textile, there's a great interest in there. There's a demand. There are some regulations coming, but maybe the infrastructure isn't quite there at the moment. So sorry, there's a long way to sort of summarize that, but it's a great article.
Simon, it was a brilliant response. And I was going to say, for our listeners and viewers that want to check out the original piece, we'll obviously link to it in our various materials. But Simon's, I think, brilliantly identified the holy trinity of key points that are made within the piece. What I want to do, Simon, if possible, is I want to just dive into kind of each on their own merit, if you like, and just sort of pose a few questions in each. So starting with regulation. Again, excuse my naivety around this particular EU regulation, but obviously in our world, we've had the Green Claims Directive, which has obviously been rowed back from. We've had CSRD that's been rowed back from. These are all European initiatives. How robust is the ESPR from a regulatory perspective? I think it was initially brought in, or certainly the sort of pilot phase has been in 2024, if I've understood things correctly. Like, how are things sitting? Is this definitely going to be sort of ratified and brought into play? And if it is, are you confident about the impact that it can have from a regulatory perspective?
Yeah, I think the short answer is we don't know, Charlie, in terms of how things are going to evolve. As you say, we've seen things, unfortunately, being delayed or rowed back on, in the last sort of, 6 months even. So I think if we take a step back, for me, overall, it sets a direction of travel. And, we could talk and laugh about all the 3-letter or 4-letter acronyms that are out there. I've got them written here. You've got ESPR, DPP, EPR, CSRD, CSDDD, it's a common sort of trope in sustainability, is that too many 3-letter acronyms, TLAs. But I think for me, again, personally, they're setting the direction. When I talk to, and again, it's probably a bit of an echo chamber, I'm talking to sustainability people and investors in this space. Yes, there are some headwinds right now for various reasons, but overall they remain confident about the direction of travel in terms of they're making investments for 10, 15, 20 years ahead. And there are always going to be bumps along the way. But overall, we feel confident we're all still heading towards the right direction. There are still lots of things to get right and to talk about as an industry. But overall, I think one has to be confident. Otherwise, it's hard getting up and keeping going, isn't it? So I think you can be optimistic, but also realistic at the same time.
Simon, I think you're absolutely spot on. I think I'm really delighted that on a recent presentation I gave where I was asked about the rollbacks in regulation affecting kind of sustainability communications. I was asked what does overall sort of look like, and I'm pleased to say I pretty much exactly responded with your response, which was to say, look, whether or not it comes into play, as it's sort of initially formed, or whether or not it's delayed, etc., the headwinds and the trends are clearly set. So we either look to get on and get ahead and perhaps realize some competitive advantages from acting now, or it'll happen at some point in the future. But the headwinds are set. So it's great to hear that. Out of interest, just for our listeners and viewers who haven't read the article and aren't aware of the ESPR, which I know I'm not going to try not to use too many acronyms during the rest of the conversation, but what are the key fundamentals of this piece of regulation, and how is it going to affect the textile industry directly?
Yeah. And again, I wouldn't claim to be a legal or regulatory expert, Charlie. So I'm trying to view this through the lens of commercial reality and again, sort of thinking about how we can then respond to this as a business, because we're right at the start of the value chain, if you like. But there are probably a couple of areas that would stand out for us. Obviously, the focus in terms of product on durability, repairability, and recyclability is key, because when this becomes regulation, that's what our customers, the brands and retailers, our indirect customers, are going to be looking for from their product. I remember a very smart person saying to me years and years ago in the industry, there's nothing more sustainable than a garment that lasts. So durability, even then, that was probably 20 years ago, Charlie, and he was right. And so it's great to see durability is within those sort of three areas that the EU is looking to enforce. How they define, substantiate durability, obviously, is another question. But I think that is helping some of the decision making around what fibers and what technologies that our customers ultimately want to see in their products. One could argue that it's not entirely joined up, and there are much smarter people than I that will give you the reasons for that. One of the challenges perhaps is recyclability, as we just touched on. The infrastructure currently isn't there. There is a lot of investment. There are some great people in the industry, even here in the UK, working hard on recycling. But to enforce something at the moment that doesn't have the support in terms of infrastructure currently, again, these are where maybe the things aren't fully, integrated perhaps. But overall, great, because that gives our customers a bit of a sort of North Star as to where the product should be going. And then the second thing I think for us, which is interesting, is something I bore my boss with all the time, is the digitalization area, DPP, digital product passports. And as we mentioned, the textile industry is probably, really old fashioned. That hasn't changed much for thousands of years in terms of weaving and knitting. So this is why I see digitalization as such an opportunity rather than a threat, in terms of, how can we help customers save money? How do we help reduce emissions by not sending samples around the world? Yes, fashion and textiles is still a very tactile industry. You still need to see and feel things currently. In the future, we're probably doing this, through amazing haptic sensors and an AI. But digitalization of fabrics, colors, all these amazing systems that will allow us to do that, to share fabrics, faster in a more efficient way, and then offer the traceability. So again, there are some great traceability platforms out there, some great labeling systems that, can be applied to garments that, will tell the end user what to do with the garment when it's at the end of that life, how to care for it. All those sort of opportunities, John, I think in a few years, we'll be looking back saying, gosh, why didn't we do this sooner? So I think in terms of the two things that stand out, one is around the product specific areas for ESPR. And then secondly, it's that digitalization opportunity, which I think is a great way for certainly players like us are at the start of the value chain, and we're the biggest. We're the biggest producer of elastane or spandex by market share. So we touch a lot of people, and a lot of players in the value chain. So we could be a thread to help, unite the industry and, help them create traceability through the system as we supply the fiber that goes into fabric, that goes into garments. So that's why I see things like this as an opportunity for us.
Simon, that was brilliantly described. I'm going to play, and feel free to, carrying on the cricket analogies, give me the forward defensive on this one. But is this? You mentioned that the textiles industry is I'm going to use probably not a correct term, but slightly archaic in terms of its adoption of things like digital innovation, which you've just beautifully described as a massive opportunity. Could you argue that that's sort of a low-hanging fruit, if you like, that's ultimately going to likely shift the dial to a certain degree in terms of that traceability and that sort of transparency around the materials that are at play within the textile industry system, if you like? But is there the elephant ultimately in the room here when it comes to sustainability within the textile space, which is essentially we just need to consume less, and ultimately we have a problem around just consuming more and more and more, and especially within, and touching on the kind of fast fashion industry space. Like, what's your take on that? Like, how does it feel to you, like working on, yes, all of these innovations that are going to deal and move the mark on, material transparency, et cetera, but do you ever reflect on that bigger, broader piece of like, how is this ever going to really work if we don't work out how to consume less?
Yeah, it's a super topic, Charlie, and I'm a chronic overthinker, so I do think about this a lot. And there are almost two answers to that. One is sort of ethically, and as an individual, we probably have all the things we need right now. We don't need more things, and therefore the idea, as you say, is about sort of durable products, things that last, which is still a definition of sustainability. There could be, the counter argument to that, or additional to that, is thinking that, textile to textile recycling is a little bit of a cheat for the industry, because it allows the industry, of which we're a part, to keep making stuff, because then that stuff can be recycled. So again, that's an ethical question. We'll all have different views on that. I don't think there's a perfect answer right now, and trying to do something to move us in the right direction is better than nothing and waiting around for a perfect answer. So, looking at full life cycle analysis of the whole recycling, process, is that good or bad? Ultimately it's got to be better because we're reusing things. But to your point, on a personal level, I would, find it hard to disagree that we probably have all the things that we need right now and don't need lots of extra stuff. But if we still are living in this society where we're making, and making new things, then having a recycling option is better than current options, I think, and will only get better because we'll keep making improvements to that.
Progress over perfection, I think. And again, coming back to the very beginning of our conversation, the pragmatic appreciation and view of how we adopt and evolve and change the way that these Goliaths essentially operate, and having an appreciation of that. Let's talk about that. We've sort of jumped. We discussed the regulation. We've discussed digital innovation in the form of DPPs, and you've touched upon the impact that can have and the low-hanging sort of fruit nature of that for the textile industry. The final sort of the holy trinity that you picked out was textile innovation itself, material innovation itself. Tell me a little bit more about what's going on. Like, I'm excited to hear, I guess, about some of the new things that are happening.
Sure. And I think that's, as I say, it's a big part. Everything's connected, Charlie, right, to this. But in terms of fiber innovation, as I mentioned, I don't think there is a perfect solution right now at the moment. And also, we don't know what, to your point around regulations, we don't know what the end destination looks like. So there's a lot of confusion still in our brand and retail customers. What's going to land, what's going to stick in terms of regulations. So there's still a sense of confusion, which is why, as a business, Hyosung is really focused on offering a range of different fiber solutions. So I'll give you some examples. We want to, we're aiming to be net zero by 2050. We've got some, significant goals along the way to get there. but you can't get there overnight. So for us, it's around making steps, improvements along the way. And by that, linking to some of our product offerings, we offer currently a recycled elastane. So obviously there's a whole discussion around post-consumer recycling, as we alluded to, in particular with elastane. Elastane within garments above a certain content within that fabric, is difficult to recycle. So as an elastane, as the biggest elastane manufacturer by market share, we're obviously investing a lot of time and resources into finding a solution for post-consumer recycling of garments with blends, including elastane. But again, so that's an option that will come in the future, or we'll find something else.
And so let me, again, excuse my absolute naivety on this, but is the complexity around the separation of the elastane from other materials that have gone into the garment? Is that the problem? If it was all, and again, I don't know if it's even possible, but if a garment was made fully of elastane, then that is something that's more easily recyclable.
That's right. Yeah. If you talk about mono materials in that way, only using one thing, and again, that's a great idea and can be done for some products. But then, especially with things like outerwear and other things, you've got zips and poppers and all this sort of stuff, where there are solutions to make them, for example, out of polyester, but maybe they don't function as well, or maybe they're more expensive, or in some cases they do work. But, it's not a solution for everything right now, because a mono-material garment is going to work in a different way than one that has a blend of different fibers. So again, that's better than nothing, Charlie. It's a good step in the right direction. And mono-materials helps with the recycling process, definitely. But right now, there's a lot of energy and excitement around recycling technologies, which are able to look at separating the different components, whether that's polyester, cotton, nylon, and now, of course, elastane. So a lot of investment, a lot of time and resources, and we are, leading the charge there. As I say, we'll find something. We're partnering with a lot of external recycling companies to also work with them to see how we can use some of those separated fibers and can we respin them, those kind of things. So, and this is another point maybe, Charlie, is none of us can do this on our own. We have to work together somehow to find a solution. So that's another sort of key point for me within the industry is, the problems are too big to solve on our own. We need to collaborate, and textile to textile recycling is a good example. So either we together will find a solution for that textile to textile recycling, or we'll invent something that replaces the things that are problematic in that area, a new type of stretch, something like that. Again, there are some out there. They're, small scale and evolving and getting better all the time. But through creative destruction, either we'll invent something that'll help us with the recycling, or a new product will be evolved or will develop that will, deliver the benefits of elastane, but will, support a more efficient recycling process in the future.
It's super interesting, and obviously it's great to hear that these innovations are at play, and even you're touching upon the role of partnership and collaboration in the industry. The fact that that's happening, again, that's a theme that comes up on the show a lot, is talking about like how do we create cross entity within industry partnership and collaboration in order to address these problems. Fantastic to hear. Let me ask you this, son. If you just pull together, like, because you've been an expert working in the textiles space in one form or another for years now, like, how optimistic are you about the future of the textiles industry? Can you give us a sense of what your vision is for the industry as a whole? Like, where do you think we might get to? What does the world look like when we adopt these new innovative materials and these new processes around recycling, etc.? Like, what are we working towards?
That's a really interesting question. Everybody's asked me that before, and I wouldn't profess to have a grand vision for the industry that that would set the direction and get everybody sort of following behind. But for me, personally, what I think I would love to see certainly revolves around recycling to start with. Okay. That's a great thing. The infrastructure is there in a way that we recycle, stuff from our, from packaging waste and all those other things we can recycle now. 15 years ago, that didn't exist. Now we're doing it, and it's become the norm for younger people. So hopefully in the future, the same will happen with textiles. That's one area that I get very excited about, can see working with the right investment and the right sort of strategy. I think another area as well is moving away from fossil fuels to renewables, which we haven't touched on so far.
No.
And, I spent a few years in the wool industry before I came back to the world of synthetic fibers. And I learned so much around, natural fibers, the benefits of wool, regenerative agriculture, giving back to the land, not simply keeping things sustainable as they are. And that's something that really excites me personally. And so I think this whole idea of helping industry move away from fossil fuel-based raw materials to renewables is another fascinating area. So it's an area we're also leading with our bio-based elastane. We launched a few years ago using industrial corn. Next year, we'll be the first to bring out the bio-based elastane, partly using sugarcane. So using sugarcane as a raw material. So, that helps us to make something called BDO, which is a component of elastane and many other things. It's used in footwear, packaging, automotive. Hyosung is the largest purchaser of BDO in the world. And that BDO currently is made using coal-based resources. So if we can move away from that to renewables over time, replace the fossil fuel-based with bio-BDO, that's a huge saving, not just in the apparel and textiles industry, but also in footwear, in packaging, in automotive. So that's a sort of grand gesture. That's where we ultimately want to get to. Again, we can't get there overnight. We can't get there on our own. It needs collaboration. But I think, to your point, Charlie, those are probably the two big things that I would still be excited about and hope to see. And, as my kids get older and their kids' all that sort of stuff. But recycling and awareness and infrastructure, it just becomes habit. And then, larger scale renewable raw materials being used at scale like we're doing now and others are doing with, in the bio-based space.
Hi, let me ask you this on it. This has just jumped into my mind. We're often having conversations on the show about like the role of leadership in and actually almost I always find it's fascinating to me, the role of kind of the leaders of our organizations, the organizations that can affect significant change, and how it's amazing to me that within these huge companies with vast influence in different areas and levers to pull, that it can still ultimately come down to the mindset and attitudes of a few people that can ultimately then be the biggest lever to drive change and influence. And Hyosung is a company that, you guys have got some of that, potential global impact and reach. Just touch upon the attitude internally of leadership and yourself towards the responsibility that you as a company have to enact the kind of changes that you've described. Like, how does that make you feel personally working on that kind of potential scale and impact?
Yeah, gosh. Firstly, the company piece, and then maybe how does that make me feel? But I think it's a great opportunity for Hyosung. It's one of the reasons I sort of came back to the business, in that we've grown very quickly to be the largest manufacturer of elastane by market share. We're also a significant supplier of specialty nylon and polyester. And obviously, market dynamics have changed since we started making those products, 30 years ago. So, things are, the markets and the landscape looks very different now. And so what's good about our position is our chairman he acknowledges this also and knows that, to continue to thrive as a business, to continue to be financially stable, to invest in innovation, we need to think about a couple of things. One is branding and storytelling, how to help our customers, back to this value system, how to help the customers know they've got the right thing, how to substantiate any claims. We haven't touched on green hushing and all these, challenges that we face. So one is branding and communication. And the second for the chairman is innovation and sustainability. So he knows that is going to be a way forward to help differentiate us versus, competition. So it's great that the business has that vision. Of course, then you have to think about how do you enact that as a business. But to have the chairman, and we were with him at a meeting in London a couple of weeks ago where he laid this out very clearly. That's great. That's great. How does it make you feel?
And Simon, sorry, just to touch on that again. It's great to hear the pragmatic view of why this is important. I think for me, the danger that I feel, if I'm honest, when I hear about leaders who talk about the moral or ethical imperative in order to invest in these areas, you think that's not going to last. That's going to be, that potentially is something that under pressure can change. But when there's a compelling commercial justification and strategic justification for investing in this, that's when you think, right, there's some solidity, there's some real foundational thinking that's gone into driving this in this way. So I don't know, is that an observation for you that you feel more confident in the strategy because of those considerations?
Well, definitely, and one hopefully sees a mix of a bit of both of that, Charlie, and that we as people want to do the right thing because it's ethically, morally the right thing to do for lots of reasons, for the people that came before us, the people that come after us. So that's a lovely place to be. But you also got to align that with being pragmatic. We're a business. We have to survive. We have to make a profit because that profit allows us to then invest in new things, to buy new companies, to, for example, invest. Last year we invested we made an announcement to invest $1 billion in our plant in Vietnam to upgrade that facility to start using bio-BDO to make bio-based elastane. So, those kind of investments don't come around if you're not being successful as a business and not making a profit. That leads to then other, challenges, which we don't have time for on today's discussion around, sustainability premiums and how does that land within the market? When you invest in new things, often those things involve setting up a new value chain, setting up, new investment in innovation. So what you have to recoup that investment somehow. And that's where probably the industry is maybe getting a bit more creative about how to manage that premium across the value chain. But again, that's probably another topic for another guest, Charlie. But I think you're right. It's great to have a chairman who sees the pragmatic as well as the ethical reasons for wanting to continually improve and do things. And none of us are perfect. We wouldn't pretend to be. And that's why I keep coming back to this thing about making small steps along the way. Trying to progress and not worry about perfection. And that for me is a thing I think about a lot when it comes to, okay, the chairman set the direction. Now, how do we enact that as a business? And that's often behavior change, which is another topic altogether.
Hear, Simon. You're going to get your first hear of today's recording. Now, I did ask you about your personal experience of working in that context, but we don't quite have time for that question. Again, might be able to staff you for another show where we might be able to dive into some of these themes again. But for now, I want to conclude, and I'm intrigued to see what you're going to do with your magic wand. I'm going to ask you the magic wand question. If I was to hand you a magic wand, Simon, and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
Yeah, I think, Charlie, for me, it would be that, and I'm a contributor to this, we have lots of sustainability conferences, events, discussions, panels around the world, and those are places are full of amazing people, all wanting to do the right thing. My challenge would be, how can we almost do a meta-analysis of all of those different things so that we take the output from those conferences, those conventions, we look at them across the board, and that highlights 4 or 5 critical things that we're all talking about. And then you've got such a powerful platform to represent the industry in some way. So it's a little bit of an old man sort of being miserable, complaining about things. But, I think that would be really helpful, and that could then really leverage all of those good intentions and all of those good discussion into actual doing something, into some actions after the speeches.
Simon, I love this idea. And I think that the kind of comparison that I draw, and again, let me, humor me as I throw this at you, is the whole idea of going through like a rebranding exercise. We often have that kind of ideation and brainstorming stage up front where there's lots of different ideas and, viewpoints that are sort of factored into an initial research piece. But then comes the clarifying and the simplification of the messaging and of the focuses and the values, etc., that underpin that brand. And so what you have is a very big piece of wordy research, if you like, up front that ultimately then channels in and directs towards, a more focused proposition. We almost need to adopt the same thinking, but for the sustainability agenda as a whole, to create that kind of clear vision that we can all buy into. Is that, I've probably butchered that as an analogy, but is that the sort of intent to get towards clarity that we can all buy into a collective vision?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It was a super précis of that, Charlie. If we could get to that clarity, it's easier said than done because there are so many competing voices, and how do you align incentives and all that sort of stuff. But that's how I would use that sort of gift to see if we could consolidate that. For me, clarity of purpose is really important, and then everybody's clear about what we're trying to do next, and that leads to action. And I'm by nature probably too impatient. It's one of the many faults of mine that I try and work on. But, I love going to these things and I contribute to them by traveling there and doing all those sorts of things. But what I miss sometimes is, okay, what happens next? And that clarity would really help drive some action afterwards.
Well, Simon, it's a brilliant suggestion and one that I think has a sort of a fairly clear kind of practical next step. I, for one, am going to suggest that you and I are probably too busy at the moment to take it on. But anyone listening in that thinks actually some sort of, meta-analysis, as you've described, that could then pull together some real clarity around where we need to focus time, energy, and effort, I think would be a brilliant call to arms for somebody listening into The Responsible Edge. Simon, for now, though, that has been a brilliant show. Thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing some of your thoughts.
That's great. Thanks to you, Charlie, and really enjoyed the conversation. And thanks to all the many great people that I continue to learn from, but appreciate the opportunity to chat today.
And that's all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A huge, huge thank you to Simon Whitmarsh-Knight for bringing sharp insight into a conversation where fashion, tech, and policy are truly entwined. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by TrueMark, the independent mark of integrity for sustainability reporting. In an era where ESG claims face mounting skepticism, political pushback, and accusations of greenwash, TrueMark helps organizations cut through the noise with trusted, transparent, and credible reporting. Visit TrueMark.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.